everyone. For our next special address, Income Inequality in the Past 3 Decades, Globally, in Advanced Economies and in China, we are honored to have with us Professor Branko Milanovic, Centennial Professor, London School of Economics and Senior Scholar, Stone Center on Socio-Economic Inequality, City University of New York. To introduce him, please welcome Tan Xiaowan, Director of Research, Khazanah. Xiaowan, over to you.
Thank you, Sharmira. Good morning to all participants. I have the honor of introducing Professor Branko Milanovic today, who will be addressing us in a special address titled Income Inequality in the Past 3 Decades, Globally, in Advanced Economies and in China. Professor Milanovic has a truly impressive CV. He is a Centennial Professor at the International Inequalities Institute, London School of Economics, Presidential Scholar at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, and Senior Fellow at the CUNY Stone Center on Socio-Economic Inequality. He received his PhD in economics from the University of Belgrade with a dissertation on income inequality in Yugoslavia. He was also the lead economist at the World Bank Research Department for about 20 years. His previous attachments also include the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington, the University of Maryland, and Johns Hopkins University. He's one of the world's leading economists in inequality. His work covers inequality both in individual countries as well as globally, in current times as well as historically. He has helped introduce key concepts in the field, such as the elephant curve or the Lachner-Milanovic curve, which depicts the changes in global income distribution between 1988 to 2008, roughly between the fall of the Berlin Wall to the global financial crisis, and which has been used to support findings of inequality fueled by globalization, as well as Kuznets waves, which shows how inequality changes over time in response to different factors, such as wars, pandemics, and technological change. Professor Milanovic is also a prolific writer. His key books include Worlds Apart, Measuring International and Global Inequality, The Haves and Have-Nots, A Brief and Idiosyncratic History on Inequality, Global Inequality, A New Approach for the Age of Globalization, and his most recent one, Capitalism Alone, The Future of the System That Rules the World. His work is seminal in both their breadth and depth, utilizing both global data sets, yet at the same time zooming into individual countries' culture and history for insights into their evolution of inequality. I, for one, really enjoyed Capitalism Alone, as it provides a very insightful account into the different political economic systems that exist today and how individual countries' cultural context and historical setup affect their choices of political systems. In this special address, Professor Milanovic is going to bring us through the history of how global inequality has evolved through the past 30 years. I believe this is an especially relevant topic for our times. The world is at the cusp of major structural changes, driven by a confluence of factors: the COVID-19 pandemic, megatrends such as deglobalization, digitalization and automation, demographic shifts, and climate change. All these factors will have profound implications on inequality, both within and across countries. It is said that history rhymes. It is by understanding our past that we can hope to understand the future. Over to you, Professor.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this really very nice introduction. I'm obviously very honored and very pleased to be with you tonight, or actually rather in the morning, your time. I wish it were actually in person, but given the conditions that we are facing, I think this is the best that we could do this year. I hope next year or the year after it will be actually really together. I would actually speak for about 30 or so minutes, and I would talk mostly about global inequality. I actually would be very happy to talk more about inequality, the differences and similarities of inequality within different countries, especially I have in mind the United States and China, that exemplify what I call in my book that you very kindly referred to, Capitalism Alone, as the exemplars of the liberal capitalism and political capitalism. So I have quite a few slides on that as well, but I think maybe we can talk about that during the discussion. So let me start with the slides that I have here. Oh, actually, let me make sure that Okay, I don't think that actually, for some reason, I think actually there is no, I can, here they are. Sorry for that. So I think that actually now the slides are there. I would start historically, as it was mentioned, because I think very often it is really the history that is actually telling us not only about what happened in history, but actually what we might expect in the future. So the structure of my talk would be, as I mentioned, to talk about global inequality and then the past 30 years in, if we have the time, in the world, and then about China and the United States. Now, let me first make a definition, like what do I mean by global inequality? Because it is quite unclear and there are different versions of this, of somewhat similar definitions. So what I mean is really inequality between all individuals in the world. Now, that sounds very grandiose because we don't have the data for almost 8 billion people annually for all of them. But we do use household surveys combined with assumptions about the top of national income distributions that come from fiscal data to actually get the distribution for each individual country. So if we have, and I have in principle about 130 countries, we can actually pretty well get the idea of the shape of global income distribution. So that distribution treats every individual, regardless of where she or he lives, the same. It just looks at their income. It takes the household income, divides by the number of people who live in that household, and it adjusts for the differences in price levels. I will not go into all the details, but you can believe me, that's an enormous exercise. That's exercise whose results basically I'm simply using, where we actually estimate price levels between the countries, because it's quite well known and obvious that, for example, the price level of Japan is not as the same as the price level of India. So we do have to adjust for the fact that $1 in India would actually give you greater purchasing power than $1 in Japan. So after we all do all of that, then we come with something which is called the global inequality, or which we can then represent using the index that is often used in income inequality studies, which is called the Gini index, named after the Italian statistician in the early 20th century who defined it. Now, that index ranges from the notional or theoretical value of 0, where everybody in the world would have the same income, which obviously is really unrealistic. It's unrealistic even for 2 households to have the same income. And the equally unrealistic situation would that the entire world's income would be basically owned by one person. So the range is from, as I said, from 0 to 100. Now, this graph shows you the global inequality from the early 19th century. You don't need to ask me right now to explain how we got the numbers from the early 19th century, because obviously these numbers are much less reliable than what we have now. But what that graph shows you is that at the time of the Industrial Revolution, inequality in the world was large. You see the 55 Gini points, but was much less than it was, for example, in the after the World War I or in the 1950s. The reason was that in the 19th century, you had really 2 forces that shaped inequality, global inequality. The first was the rise of the West, which meant that actually several countries in Western Europe and then North America and eventually Japan became much richer. Now, other very large countries like India and China did not go forward. They actually either stagnated in terms of income, or actually China even went down. As you can see then, if you have large masses of people, like we had even at that time in India and China and the West, if the gaps increase, then you have the rise of inequality. The second element which pushed inequality up at that time was the increase of inequality within countries. That was quite well documented for countries like the UK and the US and even Japan, that actually with industrialization, you had rising income inequality. So 2 forces pushed inequality up in the 19th century. They were inequality between nations and inequality within nations. Now, I will go very quickly over most of the 20th century because you see there a very high level of inequality and essentially reflecting the division of the world into three worlds, so to speak. They were quite known in, latter part of the 20th century as the first world of the rich Western countries and Japan, and then being joined by other countries in Asia. And then the second world of the socialist economies in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. And the third world that was really composed or consisted of many Asian countries, Latin America and Africa. Now, that's why inequality, of course, was at its peak in the latter part of the 20th century. Now, you see on that graph what happens in around 1990 or the year 2000. And that's actually quite important in global historical terms. You see the rise of Asia. Now, of course, China is the main engine behind that, and India and Indonesia then, and Thailand and Vietnam and Malaysia and many other large Asian countries. But what the logic there is exactly the same, or if you will, the opposite geographically from the logic of the 19th century. You have now the decline in global inequality because large, very populous countries that were previously poor are catching up. So it's almost like a mirror image. And I really would like to insist on that. The rise of Asia is really the mirror image of what happened in the early 19th century, except that while that in the 19th century pushed inequality up, in the 21st century is pushing inequality down. I will come to that later in the talk because one of the things that I would like to discuss is what could be, and it was actually mentioned in the introduction, what could be the turning point now with COVID and with all the adjustments and uneven rebound that we are witnessing between the countries. So we might be actually, as we speak, at something which is an important turning point. And I don't want to over-exaggerate that, but I believe that actually there is very strong possibility that we might have a change in trends. Now, this is simply the same graph, except here I'm showing it only as a between country inequality. So you notice that actually that between country inequality really rose up very significantly as the Western countries became rich. You will notice that in the early 19th century, the gap between the richest and the poorest country was about 4-1. Nowadays, the gap between the richest and the poorest country is more than 120-1. Now, it's true that actually there are many more countries today there than 200 years ago, but there is nevertheless an increase in that the extreme values in between country inequality. Now, this is the within country inequality, which, as I was saying before, during the 19th century increased, then remained relatively large or shrunk in the latter part of the 20th century, and now maybe also increasing. So this is what we have currently before the COVID crisis. We have a decline in between country inequality, mostly because of China and India, and we have the increase of what I call, actually, I think I should have shown this earlier, what I call nowadays increased cleavages within countries. So that's where we were in 2019 with the COVID, before the COVID crisis. These are simply the same, basically the same graph with now sort of taking China out, or the other, I mean, the bottom line is without China and India. Now, the value of that, when you take China and India out, and when you notice that the global inequality doesn't go down, is that it highlights something which I think would be increasingly important, and is the position of Africa. In other words, without convergence of African countries in the future, we might not have continue the decline in global inequality. So that's a force now which we have to reckon much more seriously than in the past. First, because these countries have not converged, unlike many countries in Asia. And secondly, African continent is the only continent with a expected large increase in population. As we all know, particularly now with large Asian countries like China that is facing the aging problem, and of course, as you know, Korea and Japan have already faced that, and Europe is facing it. Africa simply numerically becomes extremely important for global inequality. This slide sort of illustrates what I was saying before, is the share of US versus China in global GDP, which is expressed in PPP terms. So you notice that China has overtaken the US approximately around 2015 in PPP terms, not obviously still in the exchange rate terms. And then there is also a fairly striking graph which shows you the same reversal of the positions between India and Germany. It's actually, the scale is not the same, so it looks even more dramatic, but it is nevertheless very important. Now, let me go back to China, because China obviously attracts, for many reasons, greatest attention. First, because it's the largest country in the world, and secondly, it has had for 40 years an extremely high growth rate. So this graph is a somewhat complicated graph, but it attempts to show the role of China in terms of global inequality. When the line is below zero, that means that China is reducing global inequality. When the line is above zero, as it was, for example, in some periods in the past, it means that China is adding to global inequality. Now, how was China, for example, adding to global inequality in the case of the Great Leap Forward? It was adding it because it became poorer. And as many people, in those days, China had about 800 million people, as many people became poorer, they, of course, were further apart from the rich world, and that added to inequality. Now, start looking for 1978 approximately, and you see that line being always below 0.0, meaning that China's growth is reducing global inequality. And this was an extremely important point. However, because China has become in the meantime fairly rich, or what is called high middle income country, it no longer plays that role. In other words, we are currently at a situation where China's growth is neutral as far as global inequality is concerned. And furthermore, as China becomes richer and richer, it would actually create gaps between herself and countries like Nigeria or Sudan or Congo or Ethiopia, and would increase global inequality. When I gave this talk several times in China, people were very surprised, because there is this sort of a impression among people in China, as among people in the United States and elsewhere, that China is this great engine of global inequality and poverty reduction. It is true for poverty, and it was true for inequality. But, you know, things change. If you go for 40 years and become richer, then your position in global income distribution changes, and you are no longer contributing to the reduction of global inequality. So this was actually the case now, and that put a spotlight first on India, because India started growing from the year about 2000 quite, fast, and was that second engine of global inequality reduction. But now that engine is, as we know, showing some problems, because last year it had a double-digit negative growth. This year probably will have a negative growth. So the role of India becomes very unclear, and actually it might, because of its decline in income, might actually again push inequality up. So this is the position with respect to China before COVID. So I'm not going to read this slide. This is what I've already basically said. It's now put maybe in slightly more technical language. But the question becomes, if China's rebound and China's growth continues, it would, of course, move further and further up in the global income distribution. So it would actually play within a decade the same role that rich countries' growth plays. It's not only no longer the engine for global inequality reduction, it will become the engine for global inequality increase. And as I was saying before, that actually from the global perspective, it really puts the onus of global poverty, global inequality reduction on Africa. Once again, I want to point out that when we talk about inequality, we are talking about relative differences in income. We're not talking about the reduction of poverty. So obviously China, with its growth rate, would contribute to reduction of poverty within China and would continue contributing to global poverty reduction. But its effect on inequality will become muted, and possibly actually inequality increasing in the years to come. So that means that we will now no longer have this very easy picture of the world where the two great engines of convergence, namely India and China, are working in unison and reducing both global poverty and global inequality. But that has produced what I call the greatest reshuffle in global incomes in the last 2 centuries. Now, this is, of course, the watershed years that we all know well, that actually basically in less than 10 years, in the early 1980s, about 60% of the world population started living under a very different economic system than before. We are, to a large extent, as we all know, now seeing the end of that particular model. And we see it in the changes that are currently in place with respect to within national inequalities, both in the US and China. I think we will talk probably more about that during the Q&A session, but I would just like to draw your attention to the fact that what we currently see in China is an attempt to deal with some long entrenched inequalities, starting with regional inequalities, greater investment into Western provinces, removal, or permission of hukou system being implemented by individual provincial authorities. So that means weakening of the impediments to the transfer of labor from rural to urban areas, anti-corruption campaign, and then what we have seen as the anti-monopoly campaign or the crackdown. And there are fairly strong similarities also between what we see in the Congress in the United States as an attempt to actually reduce or curb the increase in inequality. So I think in both cases, for different reasons and under different conditions, the US and China have reached a position where the authorities or the government or the parliament are trying to enact some measures that would keep inequality in check or even possibly reduce it. I want also to mention that this is something different from the last 10 years, because during the last 10 years, we have seen, especially in the West, lots of talk about reduction of within national inequalities, but we have not seen any action. Actually, until very recently, I was asking my friends to show me individual actions that have resulted after 10 years of talk, and there was nothing. Now, that does not mean that what currently may be in front of the Congress, or it will be actually, hopefully, would happen. There are many obstacles, but I think that there is a realization that one type of policies, an era has come to an end. Now, that era has created something that we can call the global middle class. You can see it on this slide when you compare 1988 and 2011, and even more strikingly, if I had the data actually for 2020, you see that middle, this is the world income distribution, you see that middle which is emerging, which didn't exist in the past. Now that means that when I was speaking of the reshuffling of incomes, that means that the global top 1% or the global, especially global top 10%, would really contain many more people from Asia than in the past. In this graph that was actually known as the elephant graph, which looked at the 20 years of globalization, this was really sort of displayed by the fact that people who were in the middle of the income distribution globally, that I called, just for simplicity, China's middle class, whereas actually in reality, there are more people from different Asian countries. But these are the income groups from those countries that had the largest increase in real income over the 20-year period from 1988 to 2008. Now, the group that actually did not see much of an increase in their income were people who were richer than what you can call China's middle class, but in Western countries, but whose growth was very meager. We are talking about, in this graph, this is the average growth of all that group, which is almost 0%, But you had there people who had a growth rate of 10% or 15% over 20 years, which really means that the growth rates were under 1% annually. Compare that with Chinese middle groups, particularly in the urban areas, and actually the top in the urban areas that had growth rates which were close to double digits. So what then happened is a significant change, and actually this is what is happening and would possibly accelerate the change in the composition of the global top. Not only 1% and not only billionaires, but global 10%, which is lots of people. We are talking there about 700 to 800 million people. Now, the global top 1% historically was essentially composed of people in Western countries. And that is changing significantly because of the rise of Asia, and especially because of the large numbers of people. So when you have, for example, 1% of Chinese population moving up the global income ladder, we are talking there, about 14 million people. This is the size of a sort of average European country. So this is why that reshuffling is extremely strong. Another thing to realize, when you have a reshuffling, you are actually changing positions of people. So that means that people essentially in Western countries that used to be high up in percentage position, let's suppose somebody was at the 95th percentile globally, they would be pushed down even if their real income doesn't go down. So if their real income does not keep up the pace with the increase of real income of the four newly coming groups, their relative position would slide down. And I think this is something that we have to take into account both psychologically and in terms of the consumption pattern. If your global position in the world is at, let's suppose, 95th percentile, it implies a certain type of consumption pattern. If you slide down, even if your real income does not decline, your consumption pattern would change. And that, I think, for many people would represent a very significant adjustment. Now, in the more recent period, after the financial crisis, we have continued, of course, the situation of the Asian catch-up, as you can see on this graph that is actually using either both GDP data and data from household surveys. You see, of course, Asian countries having, on average, the highest growth rates, and actually Western European countries and North America and Oceania, meaning essentially Australia and New Zealand, having close to zero growth rates. And the equivalent of the elephant graph now looks a little bit different, because the top of the trunk is no longer showing that high increase as in the previous period, essentially because the financial crisis really affected quite a lot capital incomes of the people at the very top. I'm not showing you here the results, for example, which I have all the way to 2019, where we have some increase again among the top 1% and people at that level, with actually incomes have risen again. But that increase was not nearly as dramatic as it was in the first period and as it was in the elephant chart. Now, as you know, the elephant chart has been used by many people to show that the dissatisfaction or malaise among the middle classes in the Western world has produced political changes. The election of Trump was obviously a big one, but also there were other effects like possibly Brexit, the importance of the Gilets jaunes movements in France and elsewhere. So the changes in global income distribution, although at first they might look very abstract, in reality have very concrete effects politically, and also they have concrete effects on the perception of national elites as to their position in the world. To some extent, that it's not the topic that I want to go into today, but you can actually see the relative decline of the top of the people in the top of income distribution in the United States relatively to Asian countries and China in particular, as something which motivated quite a lot of Trump's policies and might motivate also international policies followed by the current administration. So these seemingly abstract shuffles and reshuffles in the global economic position do have their, as I said before, their political implications. Here is a chart which shows you the before the crisis, before the COVID crisis, shows you the composition of the global top 1%, where you actually see, of course, the United States is being by far still the dominant country, with almost 1/3 of the richest 1% being from the United States. But you already now see, of course, China going up through the ranks, and in this slide having the third largest number of people in the global top 1%, and probably by the time that we speak now, having the second largest. That also highlights, I mean, one way you can also look at that is to look at the relative positions of the countries, not only as the mean against the mean, but where you can look at across the entire distribution. Here is the distribution of the United States. You see that even the poorest people in the US are people who are on the vertical axis. You see, I have to explain this graph. I'm sorry, actually, I did not do it. On the horizontal axis, you see people according to their percentile in their own country. On the vertical axis, you see their position in the global income distribution. To read this graph, you start from the bottom in the United States. So people who are really at the second or third percentile in the United States, they're at the 60th percentile in the world, simply because the US is a rich country. And even the poor people in a rich country tend to be, with respect to the global income distribution, relatively well off. If I had here a country like, for example, the Netherlands, even the very poorest people in the Netherlands would start with very high position in the global income distribution. Then you have here the urban China that you can see, of course, at every point on the distribution being poorer than the United States, but catching up at the very top. So again, even in such very broad brush slides, you notice, of course, the rising inequality in China, especially in the urban areas, and the fact that very richest large group, as I said, these slides do not include billionaires because they really don't participate in surveys. So we don't have here, people who are in the Forbes list. We have here at the top an affluent urban elite, which is sufficiently large to represent 1% of the urban population of China. As you know, China's urban population is probably now 700 or maybe 800, I think around 750 million people. So 1% is, we're talking about 7 million people. So this is people whom we have at the top here, not Chinese oligarchs or billionaires. Here is Chinese rural distribution, which of course, not surprisingly, is below urban at any point of the income distribution. And one of the facts that this slide sort of also highlights is a very significant difference between the urban and rural China. Look at for example, this is the red line, a vertical line at the 50th percentile. So a person who is at the median in rural China is also approximately at the global median. But the person who is at the median position in urban China is at more than the 70th global percentile. So I would have to sort of wrap this up by, of course, also bringing poor countries like India. As you can see here, India urban, which is still along the distribution below China rural, but it's catching up at the very top of the income distribution. And of course, rural India, or I could also have like rural Indonesia, or I could have rural Bangladesh, which are very poor, and where even the median income person is poor by global standards. As you can see here, actually, if you look at the same vertical line, a person who is at the number 50 in rural India, which means the median income person, is only at the 20th percentile, globally speaking. And finally, I have to show, this is the last country, I'm sorry for this, is Brazil, which is very unequal, and as you Africa would be another country with such unequal distribution. So I think actually I'm now at the Q&A time. So I would stop here while leaving the discussion of more specifically maybe of some aspects of the US and Chinese inequality, or either for the QA or maybe for the discussion afterwards. This would be an opportunity, of course, to have some questions and to try to answer them. So thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion.
Right. Thank you, Professor. Yeah, we'll have some Q&A time. I was wondering if there's any questions from the audience. Right. If not, perhaps I can just start off briefly.
Right.
Professor, we appreciate your thoughts on the impact on COVID-19 on global pandemic. I know we are still not quite over yet, but preliminary evidence seems to suggest that either rich countries or rich people do better than the poor, and this is either poor countries or poor people, right? So, I mean, what do you think are the implications of this? By right, it should widen inequality both within countries as well as, across countries, and lead to a kind of an erosion of the middle class.
Yes, it is an excellent question. Actually, I didn't get to that point in my presentation. I have to say that everything that we now know or believe that we know is extremely preliminary because the COVID crisis, unfortunately, is not over yet. In a recent paper, which was recent, but now already almost superseded, but a paper done less than a year ago, Angus Deaton actually argued that because the declines in real income in rich countries were quite significant, the crisis would sort of, how should I say, contribute to the reduction of global inequality. Because if you remember, less than a year ago, Western countries had significant declines in real income, double-digit. China continued with the growth, and Asian and African countries were not so affected in terms of their GDP. Nowadays, the situation looks a little bit different. As you said quite well, within countries, inequality seems to have risen. We don't know exactly whether it has risen in terms of income, but certainly it has risen in terms of morbidity and mortality rates between the poor and the rich. So there are really many factors working very often at cross purposes. So I think it's very difficult to say what will be the effects. The most recent World Bank estimates that I've seen suggest an increase, unlike what Dayton thought about a year ago, an increase in global inequality because the rebound in rich countries revival of the economy seemed to be quite strong. But do we know that it would continue? We really do not. And the role of India, as I was saying before, is absolutely crucial in that respect, because India had a very bad year last year and probably will continue to have another bad year this year. So while I would agree with you that within countries, COVID has more affected probably more those who are poor, I think that on the global level to say in terms of income whether inequality would go up or down is very difficult.
Right. Thank you, Professor. We have a question.
I see the questions here, yes.
Yeah, we have a question from the audience. How can inequality reduce when those can make changes are generally those who will themselves be affected by the changes?
Well, that's a very true question. I think that's the reason why nothing had been done for 10 years. It is that we have had, like, an annual session of sort of condolences and mutual regrets every year, for example, in Davos for 10 years, and nothing had happened. I think, however, that now we might, as I was saying before, we might have come to an end to that, and there may be sufficient political forces within countries that would push for change. Even small events like, for example, the release of the Pandora Papers that happened like a couple of days ago show an extremely huge difference between 99 or 90.9.5% of people who live by one set of rules and the others who don't. So I've become slightly more optimistic on that because the public opinion has, I think, changed or turned around. But I totally agree with the gist of the question. It's very difficult to see why people who are benefiting from, for example, extremely lenient tax rules and pay no taxes would change the system that would actually make them pay taxes. I think that's the problem. Be it the countries in liberal, so-called liberal capitalism or political.
Right.
Yes, please. Do you want to read it?
We have a next question from Professor Danny Kwa. Global inequality can either rise or fall, even when all that happens is China continuing to grow. In a situation like this, shouldn't we just tell observers to stop fixating mechanically on inequality? What matters is what happens to the poor.
I agree. Obviously, I never meant to say that poverty is less important than inequality. Obviously, what happens to poverty is crucial. However, inequality does have a huge importance, not only within countries, but also globally. That was, Professor Kwa's question here in global terms. It has an impact because it really tells us whether people's material condition in the world are converging or not. We cannot, I don't think we can have a stable world where differences in material conditions between people are very large. We will have, to say in most simplistic terms, we would have enormous and continue to have enormous incentive for migration, large-scale migration, if gaps in incomes are so large. That's a problem which, of course, is present particularly with Europe, but it's the problem which is present also with Asia, in Asian countries, with aging population and the need for, they have the need for the more labor. On the other hand, that labor might come with sort of issues that are the issues of culture or assimilation. So inequality does matter. It also matters in what we were saying before, without repeating it now, in your positional, in your position globally. And it's not a matter of indifference whether people are perceiving themselves to be NR in the top decile or actually in the middle of the global income distribution. So I think that we should not fixate on inequality, but we should definitely not lose attention of it.
Right, Professor, if I have, we have another question. Can you comment about your recent article of, is Norway the new East India company? Is Norway and therefore Norwegians behaving hypocritically by asking to force others to reduce their emissions while they continue to produce their opium?
Well, I do think that it is very hypocritical behavior. I was actually struck by that for two reasons. One is hypocritical behavior or hypocrisy, but the second one is the fact that that kind of policy, which actually now is being even sort of exacerbated by Norway's decision to explore and to exploit Arctic much more thoroughly than they have done so far, is supported by a majority of the population. So the problem that actually I wanted to highlight is not only the hypocrisy, is the problem that the movement for reduction of emissions or for climate change, or more extremely of that part of that movement, which was for degrowth, has in convincing people to do certain things. So if they have problem convincing 60% of the Norwegian population in the richest country in the world that they should actually stop exploiting oil and gas and actually increasing that exploitation, then I wonder how are they going, what arguments they're going to use to convince Ecuador and Brazil and Algeria and Russia to stop doing that. So for me, it was kind of revelatory how hard politically such arguments are to make if they're being rejected by very rich people who are on top of that quite aware of climate change issues.
Yeah, it is difficult. Well, thank you, Professor. I think we are just wrapping up this session. Thank you for your very insightful talk and for your insights. And I speak for the audience that you have given us much food for thought, especially for us in this region per se, on how inequality will play out globally, as well as how it will affect this region. Thank you very much. And we look forward for more of your insights in the upcoming panel session with Professor Jomo. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it very, very much. It was a pleasure and an honor.